The terrifying thing about writing is that the page always starts out blank, which means there's an infinite opportunity cost. As soon as I put down one word, why couldn't it have been a different word?
I wonder whether your work in journalism, was that a beginning for you, an awakening a little bit about what's actually going on?
It's similar to how Hemingway's characters go bankrupt, little by little and then all at once. But social media makes it so bite-sized that you can almost see it in real time. You can see somebody getting into the mode of saying nothing at all, but saying it very eloquently.
You talk a lot about hope.
Yeah, I mean, the biggest sort of discrepancy in terms of how people have responded to my book, for example, has not been ideological or ethnic or religious. It's been generational.
You don't have to overthink it. Just whatever comes to mind, you just
say.
I
guarantee you I'm going to overthink it. Whatever the hell you're about to ask me.
This episode is brought to you by EFG Hermes One, your one app for investing in more than 35 stock markets worldwide. Hi, I'm Malak Fuad, and welcome to What I Did Next from ANT Media. Here, I sit down with a new guest each month, and we take a deep dive into their lives' most pivotal moments. My guest today is author and commentator Omar El-Haad. Omar's first two books were novels, American War, which was published in 2017, and What Strange Paradise, which was a Giller Prize recipient for 2021. But it's his latest book that put him on my radar. It's called One Day, Everyone Will Have Always Been Against This. This book is perhaps the most important book I've read in the last couple of years, as it's brought together all I've been thinking about and feeling about Western liberalism. Omar writes in an easy yet beautiful prose, bringing complex issues into focus and shedding light on truths that many don't want exposed. I felt like I was reading in written form what my friends and I had been talking about for the last 18 months or so. As soon as I had finished reading the book, I searched for Omar's agent's contact details and immediately reached out to see if he could be a guest on the show. I talked to Omar about the larger themes that led him to write the book and his own questions of identity as a result of his experience as an Arab writer in the West. So, Omar, I'd like to get a little bit of a sense in order to kind of set the scene a little bit about your background. I know you've spoken a lot about your early life and moving around. You were born in Egypt, moved to Qatar, and then Canada and the US. Tell me a little bit about the experiences of the Middle East, and then what you experienced as a sort of counterpoint to that when you moved to Canada.
So my earliest memories are of Egypt, but I left when I was 5, and so I rarely get introduced as Omar. Usually I get introduced as Omar,
Of course.
And it's that kind of upbringing. My dad had to get out of Egypt when I was about 5, and that's how we end up in Qatar. So essentially the world begins for me in Qatar.
Yeah.
I was there for 11 years, showed up at 5, left at 16. And those are fairly formative years. And I think one of the really interesting things about growing up in a place like Qatar is that the place is growing up as quickly as you are. Qatar is not a particularly new country, When we showed up, my father got a job at the hotel there, and I say the hotel because there was literally one hotel, And now I went back in November of last year, and it was the first time I'd spent any real time there in almost a quarter century. And the place where my dad worked is now the tiniest little outpost in the corner of downtown. So the place is changing as quickly as you are. But I think two things stand out in terms of defining aspects of what growing up in a place like Qatar is like. The first is that most people are like you in the sense that they are from somewhere else. And the second is that within that context, there's a very real hierarchy of privilege, of class structure, so on and so forth. And all of these things you just sort of accept as the normal workings of the world. I think of things like smuggling laser discs of various movies into the country and hoping nobody checks them at the airport, that sort of thing. When I think back to that now, it feels like a very specific experience to that point in time, But when I was going through it, that's just how the world worked, you know?
Yeah, that
Um,
echoes my experience in Saudi. Yeah, we used to
yeah,
watch Betamax movies, and it was and we would get them from this sort of underground library, and it was weird.
Yeah, and the weirdest one was towards the end of my time in Qatar. We finally got cable, but cable, of course, was censored. And the way they would censor it is if you were watching, say, a movie on cable or something, and there was going to be a sex scene or there was going to be something that they, found offensive, it would sort of cut the video just as, two people were leaning in to kiss or something like that. But the audio would keep playing for the rest of the scene. And it was so much creepier than if they just let
Yeah,
the
I
thing
can
run.
imagine. That's right.
Um,
That's right.
so I only bring these things up because you get to a place like Canada and you very quickly realize that not so much that you're in a better place or a worse place or anything like
Yeah,
that, but that things are fundamentally different. Um,
yeah, yeah.
and when I first got to Canada, it took me a long time. It took me about 2 years before I felt in any way acclimated. Um, Sidewalks were a revelation because nobody
Mm,
walks in Qatar. It's too hot and everybody has a
yeah,
car.
yeah,
Public transit, taxes, all of that. So it
yeah,
was a
yeah.
real shock in the sense of being fundamentally different in almost every way to the place where I grew up.
And did you and your family feel just different in Canada? Because Canada is a lot like the US, and to a lesser extent the UK. There is a melting pot element to it where you have people from your own background, but you're also assimilated. Or did you kind of stick to yourselves as a family or as a community?
It was, I think, very different for me and my parents because generationally, there was a big difference in how we approached not just being in Canada, but generally moving through the world. I mean, I'm Egyptian by blood, but I'm not really Egyptian by experience.
Hmm.
Um, if you and I started speaking Arabic right now, you would instantly know that I was Egyptian because the accent is still there, but I have
Yeah.
the vocabulary of a 5-year-old.
Sure,
Um,
sure. So do I, by the way. So
yeah,
you and
exactly.
I will be pretty similar on that.
Well, yeah, it'll be just mutual embarrassment.
Exactly.
But for my parents, it wasn't an abstraction. Egyptianness for them was not an abstraction. They
Yeah,
grew up there.
yeah,
Um,
yeah. It was
and so,
fundamentally who they are. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. So when I say that it took me 2 years, my learning curve was an actual curve in the sense that those 2 years were very, very difficult.
Hmm.
And then I began acclimating, and I continued to do so. Um,
Hmm.
but I sound like this, you know, I sound like I'm from here. And because
And
of
they
those
don't.
laser, and they don't, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah.
so I think the baggage we carried into the situation was very, very different, but
Hmm. Hmm.
it took us all a long time, just under very different circumstances.
Yeah. And if I'm not mistaken, your professional awakening or your kind of concept of what you wanted to do came into focus with 9/11. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I was in second year of university. Woke up one morning and a friend had sent an email. My friend was going to Columbia at the time, and she sent an email
Hmm.
saying, I just wanted to let you know that I was safe. And I was like, safe from what? What's going on? And I wake up, turn on the TV, and
Mm.
it was around the time the second plane had crashed or something like that. Um, I had always known that the only thing I wanted to do with my life was to write, and I had known that from when I was about 5 or 6 years old. But in terms of connecting that with journalism, that came much, much later. It came in that
Mm.
moment because it was, I
Mm.
think,
Mm.
that week or the following week that I picked up the student newspaper for the first time and realized that there was this connection between writing and also creating something like this. Um, and so they ended up
It's
coinciding.
interesting. So I've had on the show in the past, I've had Ayman Mohideen, who you probably know from CNBC, and I've had Clarissa Ward from CNN, and they come to mind now because both of them at that point, as that 9/11 point, both of them in college, like you, um, decided that that was what they wanted to do. And in Clarissa's sort of thinking, she says, I wanted to understand how they saw us, and I wanted to explain us to them. So there was this need for communication that they both expressed. And obviously they went about it in a broadcast news, whereas you chose to go about it writing. I look back at my own life, and my parents emigrated from Egypt to the US in the late 60s. Like a lot of people at the time, there was a bit of a brain drain going on. And I think the older generation today, or their generation, would remember other points in their life where they had these aha moments where they're like, oh, so the West is not as benevolent as we think. So I think every generation has that moment of realization. Um, but I'd like to begin, if you don't mind, Hamad, with you giving us just a quick synopsis of the book, um, and specifically your reasons for writing it. Um, if you don't mind, just talking about that very briefly, and then I want to drill down a little bit in different parts of it.
Yeah, absolutely. So the book is called One Day Everyone Will Have Always Been Against This. And I started writing it in sort of late October, early November of 2023, um, with no real expectation that it would be purchased or by a publisher, that it would be put out into the world. And if you go by the sort of publisher synopsis, this is a book about the many failings of the West and the betrayal of the fundamental ideals of Western liberalism and so on and so forth. And I can't fully disagree with that description of it, but to me, the book is much more about a deep kind of uncertainty that I personally, at least, have gone through. And that has to do with this notion of having spent the entirety of my adult life, essentially the vast majority of my life, oriented towards the West. It's the reason I sound the way I do. It's the reason I have the cultural knowledge base that I do, and so on and so forth. Um, and then coming to a moment where I don't feel I can continue to be that person because there's a particular moral cost associated with it that I can't bear anymore.
In your book, one of the interesting things that you do is you weave your own story through what you're essentially trying to cope with, and how you've got your story of movement from one part of the world to another. You're grappling with these new experiences. And at the same time, you're discussing this extremely traumatic unfolding that's happening around us. Why did you feel that combining those two would produce what you wanted to say? Why was that important to you to bring those two elements together?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think there's probably a better version of this book that leans in one direction or the other, and this one kind of takes both on at once. And I think for me, it came down to not so much what I wanted to say, but what I very quickly realized I was subconsciously trying not to say. Um, and that has to do with my own complicity in all of this. Because when I talk about this Western mainstream centrist liberalism, I'm that guy for the vast majority of my life. And so it became increasingly difficult for me to write anything that I would consider to be an honest book about this subject matter and not look inward at the sort of person I am and the ways in which I've been conditioned to accept all of this that I am now suddenly rejecting.
Hmm.
So that's the reason the book's structured the way it is. But certainly, um, it was possible to write it a very different way in which I only focus on memoir or I only focus on what's happening in front of me, but I couldn't.
In one of your recent interviews, you quote the writer Kazuo Ishiguro, and he says all literature essentially boils down to someone saying, "This is what it feels like for me. Can you hear me? Does it also feel that way for you?" And I think fundamentally that is my takeaway from this book. It's like screaming out there, this is what I feel. And I think a lot of people will have kind of answered that call. And for me, what was so fascinating about the book, Ahmad, was you put into words what so many of us are thinking and feeling, and we couldn't figure out how to express this. And you've said many times that you have a really hard time accepting that your US dollars, the tax you pay, are going towards this. And I had this moment one morning. I woke up. I'm an American citizen. I pay taxes. These are really big ideas. How do you come to terms with this? I don't know what the answer is. And I think a lot of us are grappling with these issues. And I know that a lot of people I know are really, really having a hard time understanding all of this because, like you, like me, they're Western educated, they're Western leaning, and their point of the access has always leaned west, whether it's cultural, whether it's aspirational, whatever it might be. But this has really, really changed things on such a fundamental level, and I can't get over how existential this is for a lot of us.
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is that I don't know. And a lot of this book is
Yeah,
about not knowing. But to even get to a place where I can say I don't know requires that I acknowledge this in the first place.
yeah, yeah.
I've lived in the US for a long time. I live out here on the West Coast, and I have many, many privileges as a result of living on the launching side of the missiles. And one of the central privileges is the privilege of obliviousness. At
Yeah.
any given moment, if I want to, I can look away from all of this and there will be no consequence. And so to me, even though I don't have an answer of what you do you withhold your taxes? Do you resist in that way? Do you leave? I don't know. But I do know that
Hmm. Hmm.
whatever the answer is, it at least requires some measure of acknowledgement and not looking away. And that was
Yeah.
the starting point for this book. Beyond that, I could not give you an answer, and I struggle with this every single day.
When we come back after the break, Ahmad and I talk about the power of language and of social media, and he overthinks the lightning round questions at the end of the episode, so stay tuned. This episode is brought to you by EFG Hermes One, your one app for investment across more than 35 stock markets worldwide. With EFG Hermes One, you can buy and sell orders in real time for immediate execution across multiple global markets. You can keep track of your favorite stocks by creating and customizing multiple watch lists and make informed investment decisions with their advanced technical analysis tools to study market trends and investor behavior. So supercharge your financial journey and download the EFG Hermes One app on the Apple App Store and on Google Play and start investing today. Welcome back to my conversation with author and commentator Ahmed El-Aed. I wonder whether your work in journalism, and you were a field reporter in Afghanistan and in Iraq at some stage, did your eyes open at that point? Was that a beginning for you, an awakening a little bit about what's actually going on? What is really, is it really a benevolent exercise, enterprise, or is there more going on? I mean, was that a beginning of the journey for you?
No, the way I've been describing it lately is it's similar to how Hemingway's characters go bankrupt, little by little and then all at once. Um, those foreign assignments, and I should say I never went to Iraq. I went to Afghanistan. I went to Guantanamo Bay. I was in
Right.
Egypt shortly after the Arab Spring, but I never reported from Iraq. Um, but those foreign assignments had an immense impact on me, and I think
In
I
what way?
described.
Can you explain a little bit how?
So you go to a place like Afghanistan, and you see, for example, when you go to the forward operating bases, that the Afghanistani soldiers are universally put at the front lines to defend the base. So if something terrible happens, they're the cannon fodder because their lives are worth less on the hierarchy. And you go to a place like Guantanamo Bay, and you see an entirely ad hoc legal system that's being made up as people go along in complete disregard for what would be considered the tenets of basic legal integrity. Suddenly you're allowing hearsay evidence and you're allowing secret witnesses and information derived through torture and so on and so forth. But if you're me, um, and I'm not proud of this, I'm deeply ashamed of it, you are able to compartmentalize, which is to say, I see these things in Afghanistan, and then in my head I think, yes, but this is unique to this particular situation and these extraordinary circumstances, and the underlying principles still hold. This is just
Mhm.
an anomaly. And then you
An
go to Guantanamo
aberration.
Bay.
An aberration.
Exactly, exactly. So go to Guantanamo, same thing, so on and so forth. And this is true of so much of my life. What has happened in the last year and a half is that the magnitude and the immediacy and the intimacy of the horror is to such a degree that my capacity to compartmentalize has deteriorated to nothing.
It's broken
And
down.
so that's when the dam breaks, essentially.
Yeah. Tell me about your experiences in those situations as a brown American or as a brown Canadian. How were you treated? How was that for you? Were you considered same as everyone else, or were you treated differently?
It's interesting because it was slightly more intense than what I usually get, but at its core, it was the same thing.
Hmm.
And what I mean by that is, every day in the US or Canada, most of my sort of social mode of being in the world when I interact with other people is a kind of bizarre tennis match where I have to prepare for whatever serve is coming my way. And that serve is dependent on which facet of my identity that person has decided to latch onto. So I get treated very differently if the first thing someone hears about me or what they've decided to latch onto is my religion. If they know that I'm Muslim, or if they know that I'm Arab, or if it's the color of my skin, or if it's how I look generally, compared to, for example, if the first thing they know about me is this accent. Um, or they've heard me speak, they know what I'm like, etc., or if they've read the books. Those are all very, very different phantom versions of me that I have to be ready to respond to.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so what happens in a place like Afghanistan is that essentially it's that, but with guns and bombs and a much more sort of precarious situation. Um,
Hmm.
and so I found, and it works in both directions. The first time I left the NATO airfield after I arrived in Kandahar, I was driving with my fixer. The fixer is the local who does all the work and gets none
Yeah.
of the credit.
Yeah.
Um,
And who gets
and
left behind at the end?
this guy used to be a surgeon, and he was making more money as a fixer than he did ever did as a doctor. And before we get to Kandahar City, I need to change. I need to change into something that makes me look like a local. And so we stop at that gate where the Afghanistani soldiers are being, placed as cannon fodder. And my fixer runs out and goes to talk to the guy because he wants to use the little kiosk for me to change in.
To change in.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And as they're talking, I'm sitting in the car and I can see that the soldier is very, very upset. And then my fixer says something. And suddenly this guy calms down. He waves me over. He shakes my hand. He lets me in. And so I change. I get back in the car. We drive off. I say, "What did you say to him?" And my fixer just says, "Oh, I told him you're a Muslim." And suddenly the entire sort of situation changed.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and that, again, that's another version of uh, which phantom version of yourself are you responding to. So it was a lot of that, just under very
Hmm.
precarious
Hmm.
circumstances.
I want to go back to an entire chapter in your book. You talk about you talk about language as a tool, and you talk about how language is used to couch actions that are unacceptable and to make them acceptable. And this lexicon or this use of language, it crosses political divides. I mean, you've got the left doing it, you've got the right doing it. It's almost like an institutionalized approach, right? It's not. It's neither right nor left.
I mean, language is an approximation of reality, right? Language is always insufficient. We don't have the vocabulary to describe the world. But the appearance of language and the usage of language, in my mind, as somebody who is a language nerd, it's what I do for a living, um, is often more fascinating in its humanness, than the actual language, how human beings use it. And it's not a matter of where you stand on the political spectrum. It's not a matter of the nation state. I mean, in Egypt, for example, you turn on the TV station and the shows are in colloquial Arabic, and then it's time for the news, and suddenly we switch to this classical Arabic, because it has this dignity about it, and it has this sort of,
That's right.
um, it's used everywhere. The usage of language to me is fascinating, and it's interesting in a vacuum. Um, the issue here is that my sort of academic or intellectual interest in it cannot be severed from the horrific consequences of the misuse of language, and that's what a
Yeah.
lot of the book focuses on.
The one thing that I don't remember really seeing much about being talked about in detail in the book is the power of social media. So, social media is what has shone a light and has made all these issues visible and has made everyone a citizen journalist. Anyone can photograph something, put it up, and we have visibility on it. So, that performative nature of the Western leader or the Western governments that are, you know, doing these actions are no longer accepted. Um, but haven't they been doing it all along and we just are only seeing it now because we have access to seeing more of it now?
Oh, absolutely. I think so anyway. A former colleague of mine, where I used to work, um, decided to leave journalism at one point and decided to go into politics. Um, and he was eventually successful. He ran for office a number of times and didn't get in, and then did. But what's interesting is that you can go to his social media feed and you can almost pinpoint the moment he pivoted, because it goes
Really?
from saying something, and it might be something that I disagree with or agree with, whatever, but
Yeah.
saying something, to this bizarre sort of like empty calorie language about hardworking families. And you stop and say, like, what is a hardworking family? Like, is the toddler going to the mines? Like, what is it? The construction itself is
Yeah.
inherently meaningless, but we
It's
never
absurd.
it's absurd, but we never question it because it's just part of the lexicon. If you want to run for office in this part of the world, you have to talk about hardworking families and how you're going to make life better for hardworking families, so on and so forth.
Mm.
But that lexicon is available almost as a modular unit. You can just pick it up and start using it. And in fact, if you don't, you get in trouble because you might actually say something, and then you'll have to face the
Yeah.
consequences.
There's a
Media has
lack of
sort of provided
authenticity in all of this, right? Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. But social media makes it so bite size that you can almost see it in real time. You can see somebody getting into the mode of saying nothing at all, but saying it very eloquently in real time. It's amazing.
um, I want to just pause in our detailed breakdown of your book, and I want to just talk to you about identity. So, who are you in light of how you feel about your adopted country?
I'm one of those people who doesn't have a very good answer to the question, "Where are you from?" I was born in one country, I grew up in another. Um, my citizenship is to other countries now, and so on and so forth. And so I think certain load bearing beams that would allow someone to hang their identity on are not available to me in the same way. I don't just mean in terms of nationality, I mean in terms of the narratives that come with that nationality,
Hmm.
that come with that upbringing. I mean, in somewhere like Egypt where everything is named the October whatever bridge, like there's a narrative, right?
It's situated in a historical context.
Yeah, I mean it gives you a community, it gives you a national narrative, so on and so forth. And by virtue of the kind of life I've had, I'm not particularly susceptible to any of those. I don't
Hmm.
mean that as a good thing. I'm sure if I had grown up in Egypt, if I had stayed there, I would have had an entirely different outlook on this. But But to me, home has never been a place. It's never been a country. It's very much a function of memory and relationships. That's how I anchor my idea of home.
But do you feel more isolated in your affinities, in your affections?
Very much so. Up until about 2 years ago, if you had asked me, "Hey, what would it take to bring you back to a place like Qatar or a place like Egypt?" I would have said nothing. There's nothing you can offer me. I'm too far removed from these places. Um, and now, for the first time in my life, I'm thinking of it in different terms. And it's not because my
Yeah.
opinion of Qatar or Egypt or anywhere else has changed. It's because
Hmm.
my sense of belonging in this part of the world, the part of the world whose language I know so well and whose culture I know so well, um, has really changed.
You talk a lot about hope, and you talk a lot about how, even having written this book and having laid out this very um, ugly scenario that we're living, that you still have hope. And it's fundamentally because you've said it many times, that you've seen what individuals have done, and you've seen the power of individuals and their courage and bravery in the face of overwhelming negativity and fear. Um, and you've obviously placed the blame at the feet of institutions. Tell me a little bit more about this. Institutions fundamentally are made of individuals. So, how do we get those institutions to shift?
My answer generally breaks down into two very, very difficult um, lines of attack, I suppose. The first is to try and get those institutions to look more like the people over whose lives they have control. Um, it's one thing for my publishing house to put out a book by an Arab or a Muslim. It's another to look at the board of the company that controls that publishing house and see no representation of that kind at all. Um, and this is not just my publishing house. This is the vast majority of institutions in the part of the world I live in. Um, there's a kind of frontline commitment to diversity or inclusiveness, and then there's what the centers of power actually look like, and those are two very different things. And so, trying to change that, um, eh, which again is incredibly difficult, or trying to create new versions of those institutions in which that is already built in. Tell
And
you
that
on this.
is probably generational, right, Ahmad? Like you said, we're talking a decade, 2 decades down the line, when a new generation of people are in power, right?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest sort of discrepancy in terms of how people have responded to my book, for example, has not been ideological or ethnic or religious. It's been generational.
Yeah,
How younger
yeah.
people feel about this kind of work versus older folks. I can't tell you how many people on this book tour have come to talk to me about wanting to start new anything. So,
Mm.
journalists, for example, so many journalists have come to talk to me at these book events to say, I can't continue working at my paper. I feel disgusted at how it's being run at the top level. Now, they want to start their new things. Some of them are going to start these new things. Are they going to have the resources of the New York Times? No. So again, it's incredible uphill climb, but you need to do something.
Just wrapping up this part of our talk, do you think there is a tide turning? I mean, we talked about it just now, about this whole idea of the generational shift. It's not over. It's not going to happen overnight. It will eventually happen because of this generational issue, as you highlighted, right? Is that how you see things?
The way I tend to think about it is in terms of the punishment reward equilibrium that every generation and every society has to deal with. Um, in the part of the world I live in, there was a very clear cut version of that mechanism in place up until at least my generation, which was if you kept your head down and you did your job and you didn't cause too much of a fuss, not only would you be spared punishment at the hands of the state, but you would be offered some kind of reward: a house in the suburbs, the 2-car garage, this life that in every material facet was better than your parents' generation. And what we are seeing right now, I think, is that equilibrium breaking down entirely. Because when I go talk to high school kids, when I go talk to folks in college, I'm seeing generations for whom keeping your head down and doing all that good stuff is not going to result in a house in the suburbs. You're probably never going to own a house. You're probably going to be in debt the entirety of your life. And that's not even the worst of it. The worst of it is that the planet you live on might become largely uninhabitable. And so, if that entire mechanism is breaking down, why the hell should I set my morality aside and keep my head down and do something that I know is damaging to my conscience if I'm not even going to get rewarded for it? So I think in that context, there's an immense generational divide. Generally speaking, when I talk to folks older than me about this book, there's a level of trepidation or sort of, resistance or reluctance, and I understand where that's coming from. When I talk to these folks younger than me, there's not a single thing in this book that they find revolutionary or anything but benign. They've gone to a different place than me. So I do think that is happening. It's happening in real time.
I want Omar to end on a very light note, on a very superficial note. And I want to do something that I call the lightning round. You don't have to overthink it. Just whatever comes to mind, you just say.
I guarantee you I'm going to overthink it. Whatever the hell you're about to ask me, I'm going to extremely overthink.
I think that's a given. I mean, from what I know of you now, you don't take things lightly. So, but we're going to start off with fact or fiction writing.
Oh, fiction all the time. My first avenue, my first love. When the world doesn't make sense to me, I go make up stories about it. Always fiction.
And is this your first work, the book we've been talking about? That's your first work of nonfiction, right?
In book form, yeah. I was a journalist for 10 years, but the other two books were novels.
Okay. On the road or homebody?
As soon as I have one, I long for the other. It's uncanny. I was just in New York for 3 days. It felt like 3.5 months. And as soon as I get home, I get sort of
itchy.
I get itchy. Exactly.
Yeah.
Always grass is greener.
If you had to choose another profession, what would it be?
I would love to be a car mechanic. And I have an explanation. Okay, so here's, if you'll indulge me. The terrifying thing about writing is that the page always starts out blank, which means there's an infinite opportunity cost. As soon as I put down one word, why couldn't it have been a different word? Why couldn't I have gone in different? An engine is a thing, and it exists, and it is finite, and if I screw it up, I know the confines of the thing I'm screwing up. So I would love to do the kind of work that doesn't have the shadow of infinity hanging over it.
Infinite, So it's humanities versus sciences, in other words. You want that sure thing versus the thing that could go on and on, basically.
I want the product to be far less ephemeral. I think.
Yeah. What is your favorite activity?
Left to my own devices, I'm a very amateur rock climber. Of course, I'm also middle-aged, so my body is breaking down in a million different ways. But I love bouldering, which is climbing without ropes or gear, or, that sort of thing.
And you have that around where you are, right?
Yeah, I'm a bit of a weather wimp because I grew up in a desert. So when it gets cold, I don't go outside too often. But I do have an indoor climbing gym down the road, and that's where I spend most of my free time.
Nice. What's your least favorite activity?
Oh my God. When I was in New York for those 3 days, I got invited to a cocktail party at my publisher's office, and just the nicest people. Everybody was very friendly, amazing food, and I could not wait to get out of there. I am so bad in social situations.
You don't do small talk, I'm guessing.
I'm no good at it. I just, how some people walk into the room and like the room pauses because they have that kind of charm and charisma.
Yeah.
I have the opposite. People talk to each other faster and louder when I walk in. So
That's
I'm no good
hilarious.
At it.
That's so funny. So you like to be alone, I guess, much more than you like to be in company, right?
Yeah, I used to think of myself as an introvert, but I think I have very poor acceleration. I have a good top speed, but I have very poor acceleration. So it takes me years, maybe decades to form friendships. And, that's not good for like small talk or cocktail parties and stuff.
Yeah. 2 more questions. I have a hard time. Finish the sentence.
with almost everything but writing. And that's how I know I should be a writer. It's the only thing that I go back to, even when it kicks my ass.
Except if a car mechanic came your way and offered to train you, you'd probably do that, right?
And I would be terrible at it. Yeah.
Last question. I get joy from?
My kids, most days. They don't care if the book's doing well or if I got a good review or a bad review. They just want to hang out. Very few people will do stupid stuff with me and go on stupid adventures, and my kids fall into that category. So
that's cute. Thank you for joining me today on What I Did Next. I'm Malak Fuad, and this episode was produced by Chirag Desai. You can enjoy full video episodes on YouTube as well as on Spotify. And of course, you can enjoy the audio form on Apple Podcasts and other podcast players.